Hi, everybody, and welcome to week two of the DAOs Project podcast with Austin and Ethan. I hope that you guys enjoyed the first podcast, despite the fact that I royally screwed up the audio quality. I think we have that fixed. We'll also try to make that better as we go along and learn more about this podcasting thing. Probably should have some sort of microphone or whatnot. If you guys like us enough and want to fund us, we'd be happy to buy the coolest mics that money can buy. ICDevs is a 501c3 charity. Everything that we do is done as a volunteer on the thinnest budget imaginable. So if you like this and you want us to do more of it, you can go to ICDevs.org and there's a donation page there. You can mint ICDV, which is our token. And I haven't even told Ethan about this, but what I was thinking might be an interesting thing to do would be to actually take one of these smart contracts that we're talking about and that are in this DAOs project book and let users pick what we talk about each week. I just sort of threw it in a randomizer, and there are 54 or something potential episodes. But one of the things we talk about in there is this conviction voting concept, and I thought it might be really interesting to see what it would take to throw together a conviction voting contract and let people vote with their ICDV. I think Ethan and I might be
The whales.
the largest holders of ICDV, but I'll have to see if, if I have enough time for that, or if somebody wants to build it. And what I would love is for this to inspire somebody to say, "Hey, that would be cool. Let's build that contract." So if somebody wants to build a conviction voting contract, we will totally use it to let users pick which episode we do next on these things. If you want details on that, you can reach out to me, and I can connect you to the conviction voting people. So yeah, that's a big intro. But Ethan, how are you doing this week?
Good. I love the idea of playing around with different DAO aspects. It's kind of what, as a developer, I kind of want to do. Just it doesn't have to be some high stakes thing, and I guess this would be perfect because you did set up the token. Might as well have some use for the token. Get get people involved. That'd be a cool idea.
Yeah. So when you mint ICDV, you get a bunch of tokens. You basically send ICP and it goes straight into an 8-year neuron that benefits a charity. You get some tokens. IC devs get some tokens, which we then can use to give away to developers to do cool stuff. So I guess we could do, and I'm just like totally going on the fly, but maybe any ICDV that's minted this week will give to the developer who decides to build
There you
this.
go.
There's not a whole lot of value for ICDV out there. It's totally just cool internet points. At some point, we can do cool things like that and make it something fun for people to own. Let's start out this week talking about our patterns that are in the DAO book. And this week, the ones that were magically pulled out of the hat are community involvement and feedback loops. So if you're viewing the screen, you should see the community involvement screen. And this is a high level pattern. So meaning it's kind of at the top of our hierarchy. And community involvement directly supports resource optimization. I understand that it's missing from the table of contents, which I need to fix. Community involvement supports resource optimization, which is our top level pattern. And I think it makes sense that it's very, very important in DAOs. Yeah, Ethan, did you have any sort of first impressions of this pattern or any examples that you wanted to bring up about how you've sort of seen this pattern play out in the DAOs that you've been experienced with?
This one kind of stood out to me when I was going through in preparation for this meeting. I feel like all these problems are hard, but this one I'm struggling with the most, and I think it feels very abstract and hard. It's gonna be different for each of the different DAOs and whatnot, but ultimately it comes down to how do you get community involved, and is it, does it work? How much do you put community involved? Because I feel a lot of at least the vibes are everything is completely, just put it out to the community, and it's completely decentralized, which I don't think is going to work, especially for a lot of cases. How do we really narrow down? I'm making a DAO. How do I figure out how to get community involvement?
Right. I love these forces here. Engagement versus overload is one of the biggest ones that I've sort of been really marinating on. And it goes back to this idea that nobody wants a second job. Almost everybody has a job already. you may want community involvement, but you don't want to overload and overburden your community. Striking that line of come vote every 4 days. I have this a little bit with the SNS right now, where thankfully they've added that screen where you can go see the actionable proposals that don't get auto voted based off your following, because otherwise I would just be losing rewards all over the place, because there's some motion proposals that just don't get voted on. Your following doesn't vote. You have to go manually vote on them.
Hmm.
And when you have a 4 day window, that means you've got to go check at least every 4 days to see if you have something to vote on. I think there's some descendant patterns, and we'll look at these maybe in a little bit, but I think I've tried to identify some descendant patterns that could make that better. I don't know that having this pattern of anybody can submit anything at any time and then the clock starts ticking, that's a really hard pattern. It puts a lot of overload and burden on a community to be paying attention. You got to have a communication network. You have to have people paying attention. It's much easier, and you see this out in the real world. We're going to have our quarterly meeting, and the board is going to vote on these things, right? And so you
Hmm.
can properly time box your time. Say, okay, oh man, the quarterly meeting's coming up for this charity that I'm a member of. I better take an hour and really look at the issues that we're going to be voting on and pay and understand them and know who supports what. It's kind of like with an election. We have in the U.S. we have an election regularly. Sometimes the scheduling is used for to either dissuade or encourage people to vote. Nobody can just step up and say, "We're going to revote for mayor next week." Right? Like, oh gosh, I'm on vacation and I can't vote for mayor this week. It doesn't work well. I think it's a problem that we have to solve in DAOs to fix that, because there's just not enough time.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is just the, especially when you talk about things, let's say the NNS, something that affects everyone, this public good or however you want to categorize it. It's important to me if the NNS has a problem or goes down or has something it needs to decide, it affects me, but there's only just so many of us. What can I do to contribute? So it kind of feels like either you're all in and it's kind of a job, or you're kind of all out and let someone else handle that. Which I guess liquid democracy comes in to help with some of that problem. I think that's a
Yeah,
big tension.
yeah. Liquid democracy does help if you do it right and you have the experts in place, and those experts, if they're trustworthy. One way to establish trust is that they have a financial interest in being trustworthy outside of the actual vote. I've talked about this some on forums. Right now, the thought is, oh, we can pay some grants out to have people analyze the code. Well, that's one way to get community involvement, is to pay people. But that feels even more like a job. So let's take an example outside of DAOs. If you are on the parent teacher association at your kid's school, well, there are certainly probably some people who can come in and help out, especially with lots of experience because they were a former educator or they have a degree in that or they've studied it. But most people that are on the PTA have kids in the school, and the decisions they're making affect their kids, and they have a familial, financial, all these extrinsic, or I guess they'd be intrinsic, right? So that they flow out of the person, these values that flow out of the person and into their work, as opposed to something coming in extrinsic to say, we're going to pay you to go be on the PTA, right? And so I
Right.
think that's a dynamic we also have to solve. I think that's when liquid democracy gets really strong, is when I can look across the table and say, I'm going to follow that person, because if that person screws up, they're going to lose millions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
Um, Not that person's getting paid millions of dollars, because if someone's getting paid millions of dollars, that can be good. But if somebody comes and offers them $2 million, they may not vote the same way. So it's a really hard thing to balance. Um,
Do you have any thoughts on when it comes to this, the like there's the direct involvement, liquid democracy, but just like institutional, where institutions come into play? Is that just essentially going to be liquid democracy? Because I feel we're talking like businesses or just organizations that have resources that they can allocate to governance or helping out a protocol or anything like that versus an individual person or just people organizing independently. Is that an important case of just having the institutions involved?
Yeah, I think so. I guess there's a couple different ways to form those institutions. So CodeGov's a great example. Right, Wenzel did a lot of work trying to get that pushed out and trying to fulfill a need for analyzing the replica. And he went and got the grants to pay people and then found people. So there's a number of people who used to work at Dfinity that now do some of the reviews for CodeGov, and they get paid some, but there's very few experts out there on the replica, so it's hard to define them. And now there's a bit of an institution there. It took a little bit of time to bootstrap, but there is one. So there's a place now if you are passionate about, Rust code that runs the Dfinity replica, like you have a place to go with common people that you can sort of form a common cause with and join up with and enter into a relationship with. That's the sort of community grassroots type institution. And then you'll have institutions that will emerge, because one of the things I proposed is with replica builds is that the node providers who are running the replica currently have no financial incentive to really check the replica, because it's Dfinity's building it and validating it and then just telling them what to run. Or it's proposed to the NNS and the NNS tells them what to run. But there's no real reason for them to be involved. If there were some sort of chaos monkey in the replica that said if you authorize the wrong replica, you're going to get slashed or you won't get paid your rewards this month,
Hmm.
then you would rapidly see those people with financial value on the line build an institution. They would build their own CodeGov, the node provider's CodeGov that is instituted to, or they would fund CodeGov. It would be good to have multiple institutions. They would then perhaps then slice off a portion of their profit to fund that, as opposed to having to fund it out of a grants treasury. I think all of that is an evolution. Right? It's something that's going to take time. I think what you don't want to institutionalize is paying people for something that should be either intrinsically motivated or motivated from the financials, and then paying them in such a way that the organic stuff never takes place, right? That's a way to create rigidity in an institution that you don't want. Longer term, you want that community involvement to become natural and organic and evolve. Zoom in here. What kind of things support community involvement? The first pattern is transparent governance. I think this is pretty obvious in DAO world. I think there's maybe a balance, and I'll just ask you how you feel about this. One thing that I think could help a lot with DAO governance, say there's things like in the NNS we have who's a node and who's not, right? So I don't know anything about that. I don't know that I'm ever going to know anything about that. We have the liquid democracy thing, so I'm more than happy to, for now, to follow Dfinity because they're sort of running that. Maybe one day there'll be some emergent expert that knows about it. But something like that is going to have to be done on a regular basis all the time and have lots of votes. I'm okay with having a council or like five or seven individuals whose job it is to vote on that. Like it's their job to do it. And I'm more than happy to, give them that power in the DAO.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm kind of on the spectrum. I feel like it follows a lot of themes with crypto of like the completely like hardcore, fully decentralized versus centralized kind of argument. I'm a big fan in a lot of cases of the like sufficiently decentralized structures where, don't make the perfect enemy of the good. until you can find some other better solution. So I would say depends, I guess, how the council is elected and whatnot, but having a smaller subset of the population reaching a consensus on how to do something. And I think we were talking about before on just dealing with different like hierarchies, or is there how much centralized control versus splitting it all up and there being a lack of a middle ground in there. So I'm for that kind of thing. Obviously, devil's in the details, but yeah.
Yeah, I think this is where transparent governance comes in as these sort of opposing forces, because I'm fine giving over some of that control to a smaller group of people, but I still want those people to be transparent in what they do. I don't want them to be able to go into a smoky room and come up with some solution and be able to execute it without telling everyone else what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Hmm.
So I think that transparent governance is something that's going to have a whole lot of other patterns supporting it that help balance making governance not hard, but also making it accountable.
Would you, we haven't gotten to it yet, but would you do something like a role rotator in a council type of sense of just kind of like going through different parties so it's not just a purely established, potentially like long-term colluding type of council?
Yeah, I really like the role rotator. So imagine a scenario where, and this feeds into educational outreach, right? That's next on this list, so I'll just loop it right in. When you go out and educate people about how to do something, you want to learn what you think is relevant to your life. So if you run for the node allocation council and lose, you have no incentive to stay up to date, to educate yourself, to understand the situation, to contribute to the general knowledge because I lost. And that's just human nature, right? You guys don't want me, go jump off a cliff. Well, with the role rotator pattern, you can elect 4 times as many people as you actually need for this. And then the role rotator can rotate everyone out every 3 months. It can rotate people in and out. So you enable the support of people, you build a more robust organization, right? Because those people know, oh, hey, I may be up in 3 months. It may be my time. I better pay attention. I better educate myself. I better know what's going on. And now my organization is robust or anti-fragile. If there's a schism and we have a rage quit incident and the DAO splits in two, well, okay, so now each DAO probabilistically ends up with enough people to fill enough roles that are educated and know what's going on. And so I think it's just like a super interesting form. I'm hoping to build that contract very soon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, not to go on a tangent, I won't right now. We'll save it for another podcast. But I would love one of the podcasts that we do to cover the kind of rage quit mechanic, like Moloch DAO thing, which I find very interesting. And I'd be interested in your insight onto like real world applications. But yeah,
Yeah, I think one of the SNSs is trying to figure out how to possibly do that. And it becomes hard. One of the patterns that we talk about through here is when you have real world assets tied to digital assets and your DAO holds real world things versus digital things, it's a lot harder to split real world assets, right? If
yeah,
your DAO votes to buy a domain name and you rage quit, which side of the DAO split gets to keep the domain name? You can't both have it, right?
right.
Um, so those are interesting things to think about, and we'll definitely get to those. Another pattern that supports community involvement is community champions. Um, Man, this one's tough because in this environment, I if I'd known that we'd go this deep on it, I might have gotten his permission to talk more about this. But I think about somebody like Wenzel, who has had more stuff thrown at him trying to be proactive in governance than I could possibly imagine. I don't understand why people assume the worst of people
I don't know.
so quickly.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like I've seen on the forums, like it just spirals into chaos. But like at least from my experience working with Wenzel is a great community like participant, and but
Yep.
conspiracy theories just go off like crazy.
Yep. And I think we have to find some way to overcome that. I'll scan over to the, I'm going to skip a couple and go over to this one, which is Dunbar's number. It relates to this, and it's this concept the scientist named Dunbar came up with that, you know, sort of from our evolutionary sociology. I'm not sure what you call it, but humans are tuned to be able to keep up with like 50 to 150 relationships of people that they trust and have a connection with. And we, for hundreds of thousands of millions of years, we didn't need any more than to trust 100 to 150 people, because once your tribe got that big, your tribe was probably splitting. And it wasn't until very recently when we started with agriculture that that number sort of got exceeded. And if you build a permanent home in areas that are fertile, and all of a sudden it's a lot harder to move and you have to deal with a lot more people, than your brain and hormones and everything that sort of evolved us as a species to be, it starts to violate those. And so Dunbar's number, I think, is really interesting because there's sort of a theory here that maybe DAOs shouldn't have more than 150 participants in it. And that goes, well, I'll just say that DAOs shouldn't have more than 150 active members in it. How does that hit you?
I was actually going to bring this up when I was going through some of these documents on that standing out to me on speaking to me and the like concept of mitosis of like splitting a DAO. Because I think it makes total sense. Not even with the DAO space, but I have seen references to Dunbar's number coming up a lot, especially the last few years on just whether it's like social media and loneliness and friend groups, and just it's better for us to have strong connections with a few people than having all these followers and people you don't have a direct connection with. So I think it makes total sense. And I was gonna bring it up with like, is there something that we can do when it comes to public goods, or like say the NNS, of just being able to capture that there's the liquid democracy, but I feel that can get really into people kind of following who's popular versus being part of smaller communities that can make like reach a consensus on their own, which then work with other communities to reach a greater consensus. But then again, that might turn into a job. But I do think that that threshold makes sense. Otherwise, it just becomes this big unwieldy thing, like a big giant corporation would become, versus just keeping it more of a flattened hierarchy.
Yeah, a republic of DAOs. We'll talk about it more and we'll play with some different things, hopefully. But I think there may be also a distinction between members, like DAO members, and DAO supporters. I think that's a possible split where, especially on the funding side, it's tough to fund anything with 100, 150 people. But it may be that you may want a certain amount of the people who are working towards something to actually step up and say, hey, this is going to be a bigger part of my life, right? I'm actually going to commit to this at a higher level somehow. And you guys there can be a million DAO supporters, but these 100 people are going to be the ones who are really running this thing to a certain extent. And how are they held accountable? Are they elected? Those are all just questions to answer, right?
Mm.
I don't have any particular answers other than the obvious ones that we have from history. and our current forms of government, which may or may not be dysfunctional. But I think it's really something to look at. Like, I think if you're going to run a successful DAO and there are not 100 people that have been in the same room or at least on the same Zoom call together and see each other's faces, your ability to go dysfunctional is exponentially higher than if you've seen their face and you've heard their voice. Right? If
Hmm.
somebody comes to me, we've had a number of conversations and we've worked together a little bit and funded some stuff here or there, but we don't know each other super well. But if somebody came to me, tried to convince me that you were the seed of some kind of conspiracy, there's no way I'm going to believe them right off the bat because I know you and I've talked to you and I've had interactions to you. Whereas if it's just some gravatar on the forum, it's a lot easier for me to believe that person's a bad actor than if I've
Right.
actually talked to them. So
Right.
uh,
Yeah. This actually ties in with something that actually pulled me into this space right before I got into the internet computer. I kind of figured out and got into like the Fediverse, ActivityPub, and
yeah,
everything, which I think has a lot of relations of there's this idea if we just talk about social media and ActivityPub, Mastodon, of just like there being more of a federated set of no one in the world like has the same idea of what should be okay, what shouldn't be okay, how the rules are and whatnot. That's why these big social media things don't work because everyone argues. But if you really split it up, have smaller communities that have their own, set of rules and that interact with whoever has, similar set of rules on really like scaling that thing down, but being able to connect with one another still and kind of get best of both worlds.
yeah. This is another thing that's it's far down on my to do list, but it's on my to do list is a Dunbar's number based social network that um,
That'd be cool.
just says you can't have more than 50 friends, right? Or at least you can have sort of different personas, but each persona can't have more than 50 connections, right? Like,
Mm,
okay, this is
totally.
my work. These are my work folks, and like these are the people I really care about and trust in my work sphere, and these are the people in my family sphere, and I think that would be a really interesting dynamic. I don't know how profitable it would be, but as a utility, so that I don't have to just junk constantly pushed at me from outside my social circles, and
Yeah.
I think it would be. I'd use it more than I'm using Facebook these days. We'll see if I ever get to that one. That's another one somebody can pick up and build, and I'll be happy to
Yeah.
use.
Yeah. As long as it's plugged into like a common protocol, like,
Yeah,
make your own rules, kind of do your own thing. If
yeah,
people like it, they do it and still can interact with everyone else.
yeah. So community champions, those are important. So Wenzel, you're a community champion, and I appreciate the work you do. I think we have a few more than a few of those in the IC community, and you've certainly seen outside of the IC community where those have been helpful as well. Decentralized autonomy. This would be interesting as we talk about Dunbar's number. If you did want to have a big DAO, something like sub DAOs where portions of the DAO are sort of pushed down into smaller groups that can realistically relate to each other. And they're autonomous and can make those decisions, but they're also decentralized and they're sort of balancing those forces. I think that would make sense. One of my favorite patterns here is celebrations in this whole thing because I think it's one thing that we don't do a great job of, and I think this would be awesome if we did more of it. And that's both celebrating successes. It's also celebrating for no reason, or just sort of building a cadence. I mean, just like Dunbar's number sort of talks about, our social circles. Like we have a lot of, for better or worse, we have a lot of ceremonial history in our DNA. People who existed on ceremony and built entire religions based off of the year annual calendar. And that's still in it. It's why people either celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah or you know the Hajj or whatever your religion is. Like you have those feast days and things like that. And I think this pattern overlaps with maybe this isn't my job. I don't want this to be my job as well. If you're really into it, it's a lot easier to go to 4 conferences 4 times a year and get your work done and see your community than it is to have it unstructured and have to do it 52 weeks a year as opposed to 4 weeks a year. I don't know.
Yeah.
How does that hit you?
No, yeah, I think I like these different aspects of like Dunspar's number or like any of different thing where, some things are here's kind of a logic and then here's some sort of behavioral cultural thing that is positive to help out these things. So I do think that like in order for these things to work, you really got to get people involved in caring and making connection. Otherwise, it can become just whatever job or some sort of obligation. But setting that like DAO culture, like do company culture, but
Yeah.
maybe do some sort of DAO culture would potentially, make it more cohesive.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, I think, there should be a Motoko day every year,
Yeah,
right?
there we go. Yeah,
Have
totally.
an excuse to have a. There's been a little bit of this. I mean, I think Definity's birthday has been a little bit of a rallying point a couple times. They had a big party in Zurich, I think, this year. And, having a way to do that kind of and let people globally and virtually attend and have it become sort of a thing would be interesting. Voting days of certain kinds of stuff like that, I think would be interesting. The next is institutions. So obviously institutions can support community involvement because different institutions can come together to help, promote a community, to shape it and to support it. Working groups. So you and I are a member of a couple different working groups. I think that's interesting. I think that's where a lot of DAOs are working DAOs, like we're here to get work done. So working groups make sense, right? They're generally voluntary. The people who show up are the ones that get the work done, and a lot of times it's thankless work, but you show up anyway and get the work done. Have I guess maybe I could ask you, has working in some of the working groups, do you think that's had a positive impact on your community involvement? Or what percentage of community involvement would you say that sort of makes up for you?
I don't think it's a big chunk. I'm kind of spread a little bit around, but it's been very interesting just kind of experimenting, trying to find where my place is, what works, what doesn't, understanding like some of the stuff is just completely foreign. The concept of a working group feels very almost like government versus the private sector or something like that. So it's all very new and it's been a good learning experience and then being able to I think it's helpful find the people who are really committed to certain areas are gonna they might show up to these things and then making those connections versus, you know, sitting on some social media and trying to find someone with similar interests or anything like that. It can be a good place.
Yeah, I'd love to see us try some different kinds of working groups. Most of the ones that I know meet, once a week or sometimes once every 2 weeks, and the work is slow. And we're not in an industry where slow work is honored or tolerated. And so I've seen people like genuinely angry that it took so long to come up with some of the ICRC token standards. And in a sense, I kind of get it. It's like, yeah, this is a fast moving industry. Why did we take 6 months to get there? Like, well, it's hard to get that many people to commit to a time more than once every 2 weeks and show up and participate. Like and we're a global community, so it's time zones are hard, and you have people who feel excluded simply because they live in Asia and the meeting is on European time. So I think there's a little bit of a thought of maybe this goes to celebrations as well. It's maybe why you see a lot of work happening in the Ethereum community at these conferences is that sometimes you may have to have kind of like a Manhattan Project type working group, right? Like we're going to get everybody in the same place for 2 weeks and we're not leaving the hotel. Like we're gonna go someplace cool. Let's go to Paris, but we're there for 2 weeks and nobody's leaving the hotel room until we're finished. So if you want to see the Eiffel Tower, you better you better agree on the standard, and let's move on with it, and let's get going, or some sort of accelerated way to get work done. I think it would be interesting to look at and think about.
Yeah, I think that would be a lot of fun. I really need to get myself out to some conferences and do some cool things.
Definitely. I'm actually leaving. I like going in for a day. Like I'm dive bombing into Nashville for Chain Fusion
Nice.
Day, and then I get in at 10 and I leave at 10. So I'm just there 12 hours. And then right size. So, okay, so that's community involvement. Obviously, big, hairy picture, lots of things going on. Feedback loops are a bit further down. They support a pattern called packed measurement, which is, hey, what's our DAO doing? Especially in a grant and bounty DAO, we should measure what the output of the resources that we're putting into people. We need to measure that, right? And feedback loops make sense, right? We need to check and make sure that our program is it meeting the evolving needs? Is the community engaged in it? Do people trust it? Are we integrating the data we're getting back? What's the change management look like as things do change? I think we've had a sea change recently in the tech that a lot of the ICs focused on, right? There was little to no attention on AI at all until about maybe like 12 months ago. And then over the last 12 months, it's all anybody wants to talk about. And DeFi's not as popular, and NFTs certainly aren't as popular. Right? You have to have a feedback loop and know that you have a feedback loop, and that needs to be a real thing. It needs to be an institution in your process, right? You should implement those transparent feedback loops so that everybody's on the same page. Have you had any sort of experiences with feedback loops?
No, but when I was going through this, just kind of getting a sense and just wrapping my head around the theoretical, completely decentralized flat DAO versus something that's a little more of the single big contributor type of thing. In the latter case, you got a single big contributor, let's say Dfinity in the state of the internet computer right now. It makes sense. Okay, they're gonna make sure they have to like reach out to the community and get feedback on kind of what they're doing and whatnot versus let's say there's 1,000 core contributors, right, to the internet computer. So who's reaching out and then just reading on some of the feedback integration teams, which is a sub part of this. Essentially, you're going to have the DAO delegate people to, collect this kind of information, and that kind of becomes their responsibility versus this kind of more traditional. There's that one entity. That entity has to create this team. It's more. It's just a different approach, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's tough because when you work on this stuff, everybody kind of wants to be on the bleeding edge. And a lot of this process it's not sexy. It's not sexy to go collect the feedback, distill it, and then create a bunch of things that people may or may not want to hear because they want to go chase the sexy stuff. And if your data says you need to work on the not sexy stuff, then they don't get to work on their sexy stuff. So this is a little bit of a thankless pattern, but I think it's essential to know that you're not going to be long-term successful unless you're doing it. There's the startup guy, and he wrote about this OODA loop thing. I think it's actually in that capital. It's like one of the first few pages of that capital allocation handbook. But you go through this loop. You observe, operate on your thing. You do a feedback. It's all a feedback loop. And if you don't have that feedback loop, you're not going to know where you're going. Captains of ships have to do this, right? Like steering a battleship is a massive undertaking by a number of people, and if you don't constantly have these loops of people checking this, checking that, are we on the right heading, all this stuff, you run into the shore. You're grounded. This is a thankless area, a thankless pattern, I think. And we really have to come up with some creative ways to encourage it. One of the things that supports this pattern is some sort of feedback reward system. If you want the community to give you feedback, sometimes you have to give them a carrot. So
Yeah,
what are those carrots? So that's the reward system is something you can pair with your feedback integration team and have them airdrop or what come fill the survey out, airdrop or whatever, right? Token rewards, something along those lines. We've got magic internet money, we might as well use it for something,
right.
especially the hard parts. So other things that support this pattern are regular community check-ins, um, and community value alignment. And the community value alignment, that's an interesting one. It's just make sure that you consistently have alignment between what you say you're doing and what you're actually doing. One of two things can change. Your values can change, um, for better or worse, right? I think our community clearly is valuing AI a lot more than they did 13 months ago, right? That just happens because we live in the real world. So if the values change, is that keeping up with the community that you have, and vice versa, right? Your community will, um, just like that is a feedback loop. Basically, the values of your community lead to the values of your DAO, and vice versa. You're going to attract the people who have the same values that your DAO is saying that you have. And if you get those out of sync, you're going to end up attracting the wrong people than the mission that you're actually trying to achieve, and that's going to just sort of lead to more discord in your DAO. So.
How do you see that working in practice? Do you see it more of a like, you know, what do you see your company doing? Like, here are our like core values, bullet points, or just a few kind of things, or it's more of like, okay, here's what the core contributors, maybe they each have different like core values, or and then trying to figure out, you get the feedback to figure out what maybe the community's values are, just a general sense. But is that an explicit thing, or is that just kind of a implicit, evolves over time thing?
I've seen everything from here's our value system and it's 5 bullet points. And I've seen people proposing constitutions, right? And I've seen some DAO constitutions that are, if your constitution is longer than the United States Constitution, then maybe you need to read. But I think it'll certainly help you from attracting people who are just going to sow discord into your mission. I think you have to have something like that. Now, as far as how do you keep that alignment, societies have attempted to do that in all kinds of ways, whether it's guilt from mothers or priests or mobs. I don't know. It's interesting. Is there a common pattern that we could use and we could find that's a healthy feedback loop to say, hey, are we still aligned with our values? We're going to go implement this. We're going to attack. We're going to fund this project. Does this project tick these check boxes along with our values? So we have, through Gitcoin Grants 19, we funded some CK-ETH. We're using that CK-ETH at ICDevs to fund a developer who's in the process of building a Motoko EVM. So he's finished, I think, 20 of the 100 and some odd opcodes. So we're sort of on our way. It's not moving fast, and it's just some guy who stepped up and is doing this for some CK-ETH we're giving him, but it's probably not as valuable as his time. It's one of those things. I actually went and applied to the Ethereum Foundation because on their site they have this page called Client Diversity on their site that was edited on May 23rd of 2024, right? To me, it's listed under their foundational topics. This seems to be a core thing that they believe in. So I applied saying, hey, and I waited to apply until we actually had at least a little something, right? And so now we have 20 opcodes done, and the goal is to have at least a data structure that's an EVM data structure. And will we ever get to the point where we actually wire it up and build a client? I hope so. I think that would be good to have. I think it would be fun to be able to, especially once Bitfinity launches and you have EVMs on the internet computer that we can query. And I think it would be great for Motoko developers to be able to write bots that can interpret their memory and think about things in EVM terms and maybe even run transactions. And you could build validation tools, you could build all kinds of things, but you have to have the EVM libraries. So I applied for the grant and they came back and they said two things. First, they said that it's a very competitive program and whatever, and basically they rejected us. But one of the things they said was that your program doesn't fall within the scope of our grant program. And I was like, okay. And I wrote back to them. I said, wait a second. You said that you guys fund open source protocols and libraries that support and build the network and help further secure the network. I was like, did I not, was I not clear that we're building a diverse client? We're bringing a new language. We're going to build a EVM client. It can run in a trustless environment, which is something that a lot of other clients can't do. So we'll have a trustless client running that a DAO could use to a DAO could control it. All sorts of things that I think are extremely unique value propositions. Right? You could have a DAO controlled L2 kind of thing, or it could be a consensus mainnet consensus play. There's lots of things it could do, and it seemed to me like it was perfectly aligned with their grant program. So I wrote back and I said, hey, I get it. Right? Like we're very early. I'm sure you get all kinds. Like I'm not upset that we didn't get approved, but I'm a little upset that you said that the project isn't in line with the grant program because it seems like it's meets almost every criteria of what you just described your grant program was. I'll let you know if they come back and even reply. I'm sure it was probably a form letter that they send to everybody, but we'll see. Like, if you're going to state your values and then somebody shows up and meets all those values and you turn around and
Right.
tell them they're not meeting your values, like that's not a great thing to do. And I don't think there's any malice or anything like that. I think it was just they get too many applications. They don't want to give everybody money.
Yeah.
Maybe we have all 150 opcodes, we'll apply again and it'll be a different story if we actually are executing EVM transactions on the internet computer. So to that extent, I think it's important for you to say what your values are so people know how to beat them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
We mentioned role rotator. I think we've already sort of talked about that. Unless there's something additional you wanted to mention on the role rotator.
Just really quick, when you had mentioned before, we were talking about councils and other things of just kind of making it like splitting up like a full-time whatever into, you have 4 times the amount of people, you can split into 4 different chunks. I'd be curious on in the description of the rotator, it was like, oh, you swap out a dev for like a community manager, which at least for me, is like felt counterintuitive, at least to like normal kind of like, community roles kind of thing. On how exactly do you see? Is it just like, okay, the community manager wouldn't go be a developer because they don't know how to be a developer, but a developer, maybe they go do something else and developer go into there. How do you like different skill sets, like split that
Yeah,
up?
yeah, totally. I think there's two different axes. There's rotating roles, rotating the same role amongst the many people, right? Where all of those people are qualified to do the role. I think it's important that people are qualified. Then there's role rotation through. I think this is almost more under like mentorship or community education and outreach. There's rotating someone through a set of roles so that your DAO becomes more anti-fragile and someone knows how to do multiple roles. I think that the first one where you're just swapping people out, that's a thing that can be a lot more automated, and you can make your DAO more efficient and more robust or anti-fragile along that axis by just building some smart contracts. Rotating role, having one person rotate through many roles. I mean, this is what they do for CEOs, right? Like if you're going to be the CEO of Disney, they send you for 2 years to work at the parks, and they send you for 2 years to work at the studios, and they send you for 2 years to work at the cruise line, and then maybe you get into the pool for CEO because you know how the whole business works, right? And so if you want a robust and strong DAO and you only have 100 active members because we're only going to have 100 active members because of Dunbar's number, right? So if you have 20 roles and 100 people to fill them, you better have some of those people stepping up and at least learning, even if it's just in a mentorship manner, how to do some of those things that are essential to the DAO's operation, or you're going to have an exodus of some kind and you're not going to have enough people to keep your DAO running.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think like maybe you could set up in a way where you're not having a skill set of people in like different buckets and not everyone's in every bucket. Would you say that there is a trade-off between efficiency for that anti-fragility with this rotation?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some times where you want less experienced people doing things less efficiently so that you're more anti-fragile because those people will get better. There's extremes. If you have everybody doing everything, then you're not going to do anything well.
Mm.
If you have only ever the maximum efficient experts working in their exact right position, then you're fragile. That's why I say I don't know that a smart contract is as good for that second axis of role rotator. I think that's more of a mentorship thing. And we'll have more patterns that we'll look at along those lines where you sort of have cohorts of people, and it's almost as cheesy as like the houses thing in Harry Potter, right? Like if you purposely create these artificial separations inside your DAO to sort of allow more community to form, and you give those people different things to do that are important, then you'll have that will help people connect with other people that they have interests and commonalities in, and then those mentorship. I think a lot of that mentorship and cross pollination works on working groups, on this house idea. There's a couple other patterns that help that. It's got to be organic. You may want to put some policies in place to say you're going to put these three people in charge of the treasury, and this is a real DAO. Like say this is a DAO that's actually registered in the Marshall Islands or something and has reporting requirements to the government, real intersects with real world stuff you have to do. You don't want just three people to know how to do that. And so for stuff like that, you may want to have a dictate in your DAOs, operating procedures that look, we need at least six people in this role. Only three of them are going to be active, but we need six. If we fall below six, then we need to be proactive in finding and filling that role. What happens is you go to the four people that are left and say, who are you mentoring? Who do you know who'd be interested in doing this role? And I think that needs to happen organically for them to go out and find the next person to pull in and be an alternate or ready to take over. I think that's how I sort of see that happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think yeah, DAOs are just kind of a different mindset, and yeah, I think that anti-fragility is super important when you lack that centralized control.
Well, that brings us to our big question for the week, which I think we sort of settled on asking the question, Ethan, should a DAO's applications be open sourced or not?
Yes, yeah. I would say maybe it depends exactly on the DAO, but on my default answer would be yes, because I personally think that DAOs you can have different DAO structures and which DAOs. I don't think if you have a DAO, has all proprietary stuff and you have a few people in it, you're missing a lot of opportunities, but I still think it can work as a DAO. But yes, if you want the more the spectrum of the DAO where you're taking advantage to like the DAO's strengths of being able to kind of spread out the load, involve the community, have this being an ever evolving process, anti-fragile, etc. This stuff needs to be transparent, accessible, not just controlled by whether it's a core contributor or some other centralized form. because then you don't really release it to allow the powers of these decentralization properties to happen.
I tend to agree. And of course, we're a little in our own little world over here also, where we're very focused on SNS DAOs. And so this question came up because there's been a couple instances. Most recently, there was an SNS that got rejected because they didn't open source their application they were trying to launch. They didn't open source it in time. They actually did open source it, but not with enough time for the DAO to vote. I think this aligns with what we were talking about earlier with your values, right? There is for better or worse, the NNS, at least Dfinity is outlined like, here's how we're going to vote, right? If you do this, 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 and this, and we have enough time and we're able to analyze it, then Dfinity will vote. But if you don't do these things in this order, then Dfinity's will likely reject. And so being forthright there, I think is it's part of declaring your values and saying, hey, you can't launch in the context of an SNS where you have DApp controlled canisters. The DAO can't vote to install a canister that it doesn't know what it does, because especially if value goes on it, you're just asking for someone to slide something in that ultimately affects the DAO poorly. I remember a few months ago, there was someone who showed up kind of out of left field. Nobody really heard from them. And they're like, we're going to launch a DAO, and here's our YAML file. And somebody asked, well, where's your code base? And the guy was like, I've been building this for 3 months. So I'm not going to give you my code. And it's like, okay, well, look, this community here, that's how this works. If you're starting, if you're going to invest into a DAO where the founders are there to just make a bunch of money, you are liable to be involved in a DAO where the founders, the people who started it, just make a bunch of money. Right?
Yeah.
You're starting a DAO because you have something beyond just wanting to make a bunch of money. Like, you're actually wanting to put a productive and profitable utility out into the world that benefits society beyond just the amount of money that you make. And so if you show up at the SNS or on the internet computer that has the ability to deploy massive detailed applications, but you want those to be secret and not transparent, the DAO can't function on closed source code. They can't vote to install it because they don't know what it says.
Yeah.
I think that's just got to be a presupposition of these things. And there may be
I don't even think it's just relating to code, because I've seen over the last however long the SNS has been out now, maybe stuff isn't necessarily proprietary or hidden or whatnot, but at least when it comes to community knowledge, information, anything, you see, some people maybe, they have a good idea or whatnot, but they just kind of pop up on the forums, kind of come out of what seems like stealth and be like, hey, we're gonna decentralize here in like a few days. And then it's just like, who is this? Like, is this a good idea? Like, do we have enough time to understand this? Or is this gonna be like a decentralized thing? Is this just gonna be some company that is just looking for this initial investment opportunity? So, yeah.
Especially if you're asking money from the community fund, you just pop up. You're like, oh yeah, we're going to launch, and we're basically asking for $1 million out of the community fund.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's another reason it's good that I think they're working on ways for SNSs to launch and operate in a non-decentralized fashion, which that seems a little counterintuitive, but like, you got to learn to ride the bike, right? And asking people to launch a decentralized organization who've never run an organization that was even went through the motions of being decentralized is, I think, it's a really hard ask. So
Yeah. I think some of these, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think some of them structure a little too much a high risk early stage investment where the thing isn't built yet. They're gonna be building the thing, but sometimes it's kind of portrayed as this is the decentralization sale when maybe there's should be kind of split up of, okay, we need to, here's the idea, join us, invest in us, and then later on, okay, we got it. Let's put it out there and let it be more autonomous.
Yep. Awesome. Well, anything else that you want to bring up this week, or anything you've been working on that you're excited about?
No, just been continuing on daoball kind of stuff and just trying to figure out how to take some of these ideas and put them in so people can play with it. I like when you talk about the beginning of like how can we play with conviction voting? Because that's the kind of thing I want to do of just like take one of these things. Not everything is going to work, but put it in there, you know, experiment with it.
Yeah, I saw that you had a couple libraries come out
Mm.
on mops. You want to mention what those do and how people could use them right now if
Yeah,
they feel so inclined?
so the latest ones from the daoball project, one has just been kind of around randomness, like pseudo randomness. I do a lot of random things, and it's hard to work with the current random library. So just picking the next number between a range or random element of an array. And the latest one was putting out, and actually it was fun. Ilya from the working group, he found my code and he asked if he could use it, and so I threw it up in a mops library, and that one is pretty basic boilerplate functionality around DAO proposal voting. So just your basic who are your members, what kind of like voting threshold and quorum and times, and you just kind of put in what your proposals are, what you want to do when they execute, they reject, etc. So it's just a nice little helper class that you can just throw in any of your project and then have just basic DAO voting set up.
Is it pretty agnostic to the tokenomics behind it?
Yeah, this is only focusing on voting. And so like the parameters you would put in is like when you set up a proposal, how many, like which members do you have? What is their voting power? Things like that. So anything like staking, any tokens is not in there. So that would have to be roll your own.
Awesome. So you could take a snapshot and then just sort of seed a vote with the
Right.
library. Awesome. Cool. Well, so over the ICDev side, we did have a couple releases this week. We released the sort of first turn on the ICRC 75 library, which we've talked about on the working group a bit. It's sort of a listing library. It lets you create lists of identities, accounts, these ICRC 16 values. So you can create an official list of values, and then also lists of lists. So you can sort of chain together lists and say this role has access to this role. Basically, it's kind of a role based access control component for the internet computer. So we pushed that out, and then also ICRC 86, a draft of that standard. It's not a domain registrar for the internet computer. It's a way to prove that you own a domain outside the internet computer to the internet computer. In its sort of final form, evolved form, it'll hopefully use a canister that uses standard would be connected via APIs to like Google's DNS and somebody else's DNS, and it would just all happen automatically. You'd say, "Hey, I own this," and it would say, "I own foo.com," and it would say, "Prove it. Here's how you prove it," and you would prove it, and then it would automatically check DNS and be like, "Okay, yeah, Austin owns foo.com." So now, if we want to name something with foo.com in it or com.foo, you can know that only Austin can do that because he's a controller of that domain. Uh, that's an interesting component as well. And then a bunch of stuff around open value sharing, which Jordan Last at Demergent Labs put together a very nice spec for open value sharing across multiple platforms. And then I sort of tried to focus it in on here's what you'd actually do on the internet computer to do this, and release a number of Motoko libraries that help you do that, including a ledger that lets you collect cycles, sort of wrapped cycles, and then withdraw them and reduce fees both for canisters that are running open source software that want to contribute to open value sharing. And we probably should have a total complete other podcast on open value sharing, but it's
Totally.
basically because of the unique way that cycles work on the internet computer, you can write a library that if you're the author and you want to try to support the continued development of those libraries or other libraries, you can have that library send you cycles. This has been tried a couple different ways, and some people like it and some people hate it. But what we tried to do is we tried to make it so that it's very easy to turn off. If you don't want to send me cycles, you don't have to send me cycles. You just set a parameter and it shuts the whole thing off. But if you want to contribute to open value software and you want the people who are writing your software to write newer and better libraries, we suggest that you turn it on. And certainly as a developer, you should be reserved in what you're asking for here. And the price that you pay should be relative to the value that you're delivering, and you shouldn't attempt to. It's not an overly capitalistic endeavor. It's like, hey, this is a community contribution. Like, you know, send us $1 a month or something. Once you're successful, right? And so
Mm.
the for instance, the ICRC 75 library, I think sends it's like $1 until you get to over 10,000 list items, right? And then it's $1 per 10,000, and then it caps out at $10. So if you have a list with 1 million people on it, you're going to send ICDevs a $10 donation every month in cycles, which we'll use to further fund other stuff we do at ICDevs. Lots of cool stuff coming out this week. And if y'all have any questions, definitely ping us. ICDevs has a Twitter account. I'm on Twitter at AFAT. We should probably throw that up. I'll try to throw that up on the screen here. What our Twitters are. If people want to reach out and contact us and ask questions, I'd love to have some user feedback and answer any user questions that you guys might have, or
Yeah, that'd
listener
be fun.
questions.
Yeah.
All right, Ethan, this has been fun. I think we went another hour and a half. We'll see how much comes out in editing this
Sure.
one.